Jennifer that's going to be ready to get her in the next, I guess, minute or so, find out what that is. Joining us also is Dr. That's in the Boston Square. And Jonathan, I know we have these two cases. How consequential do you think the term has been thus far?
Hi, Myra.
Well, it is really,
Hi, Jane. How are you?
Hi, guys.
This isn't my camera, like in a better place. Ah. Whoever has sound going on two devices, turn off one of them, please.
today we're going to see involving so much. And we're going to be ready thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Please. Turkey vote class. So we'll jump right into it. So the past two classes, we learned. Today we'll move on to chapter 2, and I think there's 6 chapters total, so I think that'll end up is the connection not good? Or my connection isn't good? Okay.
Get as close to your Wi-Fi router as you can, if possible.
Okay, you know what? I'll go to the other room. 1 second. Okay. Is this better?
Your video is still kind of choppy.
That might just be the lighting. Do you hear me? It's not cutting out? Myra, is that better?
I think the sound is better, but the video is definitely choppy.
Okay. I mean, I think that's just the lighting. I don't think we don't have great lighting in here. Okay. So good morning, ladies. If I cut out, just let me know. I'll try to switch locations again, but I apologize for that. I'm sorry. Let's jump right into it so we don't waste any more time. Let me know if the connection is good. Okay, so basically we were saying that last week we learned chapter 1. Today we're going to move on to chapter 2. And actually, I remember like touching on this Mishnah last year when we did Pirkei Avot in the summer, and I think it's interesting to note that like each Mishnah has so much depth, and we can go on and on and on just on one Mishnah. So we'll spend, I think, like I was saying, there's six chapters altogether, and I think we'll do 2 weeks on each chapter. There's like many different Mishnahs and passages per chapter. So there's so much to unpack here, and we're just, scratching the surface, but we're doing it together. We're learning together, and we're sharing insights with one another, and that's what is most important. So today's Mishnah is a very interesting one, and it starts out with, like we were saying, we discussed how each Mishnah each passage has its own rabbi that said this passage or wrote this passage, and the author of this passage, this Mishnah, is referred to as Rebbe, as we'll see. And I just want to start off with this introduction because it gives us a good background about Pirkei Avot in general. So who was Rebbe, and why doesn't it specify his name? Rebbe was known as Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. So this is a good background. Yehuda Hanassi was called Rebbe because he lived in a time where he was the main leader of the Jewish people. He was the main rabbi, and so he didn't need to be referred to like by his first name because he was the one and only like leader of the Jewish people at that time. And so the term Rebbe. Other reason, of course, is in his humility. He doesn't refer to himself by his first name, but he remains somewhat anonymous, even though we know who it's referring to. But another reason is because the word Rebbe in Hebrew is Resh Bet Yod, which stands for Rosh B'nai Yisrael, the leader of the Jewish people. And that really epitomizes who he was. And I'll explain why. Why was he like the essence of the leader of the Jewish people? So we know, or we'll learn, that the Torah has 2 parts to it. We have the oral tradition and we have the written tradition. Now, the written tradition in Hebrew is called Torah Shebechsav, the Torah that was written. And the oral Torah is called the Torah Shabal Peh, the Torah that was given over by lips, by mouth, oral. Now, what's interesting is when there's a misconception that God gave us the Torah, which is the written Torah, and the rabbis came up with their own interpretations, their own mitzvot. They added to the Torah. Now, this is a misconception because it's just simply not true. When God gave the Torah at Mount Sinai, the Torah is very clear that God gave both parts of the Torah. He gave both the oral tradition and the written tradition. So the oral tradition was always there from day one, from Mount Sinai. It was given over to the Jewish people, but God specifically intended for it to be given over from teacher to student, from father to son, from generation to generation, and specifically not written down. Now you may ask why. Why would the oral Torah be intended to remain oral, not to be written down in a book, but it rather should be taught from person to person and passed on from generation to generation in this way? Any thoughts? Like, why can't the whole Torah be written down from the beginning? Why was it divided into the written Torah and the oral Torah? Any ideas? So the main reason that God intended it to be this way is because there is an advantage in teaching something orally, meaning if everything in the Torah was written in a book, a person could live in a vacuum on their own, not connected to any Torah leaders or teachers, and they could just read the Torah on their own from a book. But God didn't want that. He wanted there to be this duality in the Torah where some of it, yes, can be written in a book, but if you want to truly understand the depth and the meaning of the Torah, because if we've ever read exactly, Carol, it requires a sense of community. It requires a sense of teacher, student, parent, child, teaching from one person to the next. And so the oral Torah, it was not only, it wasn't written down, it was to create a sense of teaching something from person to person. It wasn't meant to be sat on your couch and read in a book. And so God specifically wanted the oral Torah to complement the written Torah, because if we know there are a lot of passages in the Torah, like in the actual Bible, that are very elusive and very confusing. And if you just read it on your own, you would be puzzled or confused, or maybe even got the wrong message. And so the oral Torah complements the written Torah. It's coming back quick. Ooh, my sound is still not good. My Wi-Fi is fully strong. I don't know why that's happening. That's weird. It's still, you still don't hear me? Okay. Perfectly strong. No? Okay. I'm freezing from time to time. Okay, let me switch one more location. I'm sorry about this. Okay. Last try. I'm sorry. Okay. So who knows? Okay. So basically what we were saying, I'm sorry for the interruption, is that the oral Torah was intended to remain oral. Down? No, God specifically wanted it to be passed on from generation to generation, not in the form of a book, not in the form of a written. And the advantage to this is, like we said, there's no confusion, right? When a it's very hard for there to be a miscommunication. And if there is a misunderstanding, the student can always ask the teacher, is that what you meant? Explain this more clearly. And it has remained whole, meaning the traditions that the Jewish people kept from Mount Sinai, Jewish people are still keeping these same traditions, and in the same down to every last detail, we are keeping these traditions in the same exact due to the fact that the Torah was always transmitted teacher to student rather than okay. So basically, it came to a time in Jewish history, and this is the time period of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the rabbi who wrote today's Mishnah that we're going to be discussing. And in his time period, it was after the destruction of the temple, and the Romans were a decline in the spiritual status of the Jewish people because they were under Roman. Jews had to practice Judaism in hiding, and and maybe audio will come through better. It's happening. It's never happened to me before. Guys, I'm going to continue teaching just because my Wi-Fi room. Okay, so
it was better before in the other location. Now you're freezing every 3 seconds.
Malka, try turning off your video.
let me try my phone. Sometimes
Turn off your video. Maybe the sound won't skip if you're not trying to send video. She'll be back on in a minute.
Hi, ladies. I so apologize. I don't know why this is happening. I'm not sure what happened to my Wi-Fi. Okay. It's very weird because it shows good connection, but in actuality, it's not coming up as good. So I connected from my phone and I hope this will be better. I was using my laptop. The only thing is I won't be able to share my screen, but I'll read the Mishnah slowly so you'll hear it. But I won't be able to show it to you on my screen. I apologize. Trying to figure it out this week, what happened to my Wi-Fi. Okay.
Malka,
So-
if you give us the chapter, and we could look it up on our screen or on our phone, and we could read it.
That's a great idea. I will find a better spot. Yes, that's a great idea. It is, if anyone has Chabad.org, they have the text. I could actually probably send it to Myra. But yeah, I'll read it slowly. I'll have my laptop open here so that I can read it to you slowly, and hopefully it'll still be understandable. So let's try to jump back to what we're talking about. I'm so sorry for all of these distractions and technical difficulties. Again, I apologize. So to jump right back into what we were discussing the difference between the oral Torah and the written Torah. And the written Torah is important, of course, because we need a text in writing that we can also hand down from one generation to the next. But the oral Torah was to complement the written Torah in a way that it could never be misunderstood. So there would never be a generation that came along, read the Torah, and got a completely different understanding of it than previous generations. It would always be, it would always keep the tradition intact because it specifically had to be taught from a teacher and from one generation to the next. It kept this transmissibility of one generation to the next. Now, we said Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who was known as Rebbe, he came along and realized that there was this great spiritual decline, and the Jewish nation was no longer at the same status as they were in previous generations. And he realized that there was a great need for the oral Torah to be written down. Now, we just said that the oral Torah was not meant to be written down. It was specifically meant to be passed along from teacher to student. And so how could he write down something that God intended to be not written down? So this was in his great, he was a righteous person. He was a holy person. And he came to this realization that it had to be this way. And if it wasn't this way, Judaism and the traditions could possibly be forgotten forever, because it wasn't the same. The generation had changed so drastically due to the destruction of the temple and due to the Romans' strict laws that were limiting religious practice. Because religious practice was not going to be the same, it had to be written down so that it would never be forgotten. And this was a decision made by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and this is really his legacy. He redacted the Mishnah. So everything we're learning today was recorded by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Now, as we know, it wasn't he didn't come up with all of these phrases. These were a compilation of many teachings from many different rabbis, but Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is the one who wrote them down, put them down on paper. Even though it was never intended to be that way, he made this crucial decision to write it down and to preserve it for future generations. And this is what we call nowadays, we call this the Talmud, right? The Talmud is a combination of the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Mishnah is what we're learning today, and the Gemara is the continuation of the discussions of the rabbis based on the Mishnah. So the entire Talmud is what we would classify as the oral Torah, the oral tradition. And once upon a time, before the times of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, it was something that was never written down. It was only taught from one generation to the next. But Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi made this crucial decision that in order to preserve these teachings, we must write them down, because it was no longer going to be the same if it was only taught from one generation to the next. As the generations declined in their spiritual stature, the content would be tainted. And he had to make this decision. And that is, I would say, that is why we have the Talmud today in all of its, it's a huge volume. The whole Mishnah and the whole Gemara, it's massive. There's actually a custom to. Ooh, someone's at the door. I'm so sorry. There's actually a custom to learn. Some people do something called Daf Yomi, where they learn one page of the Gemara each day, and it takes them 7 years to finish the entire Talmud. So that just shows how vast it is. And to think that once upon a time, this was something that was not even written down, it was taught verbally, is mind-blowing that these rabbis had the intelligence to do that, to know it all in their mind without having it written down. But nowadays, as we know, we have it in writing. We have many volumes of the Talmud and the Gemara and the Mishnah, which is what we're learning today. So this is the background of who Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was. He was a great leader. He is honestly probably one of the main. He changed Jewish history forever by making this decision. He really did change Jewish history forever. And so today we're going to jump right into the first Mishnah of the second chapter. There are 6 chapters of the Pirkei Avot altogether. And I have it here on my laptop. That's why I'm trying to configure it. So I'll read it on my laptop. If anyone wants to, if you're sitting in front of a computer, you can open another tab and Google Pirkei Avot, chapter 2, Mishnah 1. And this will come up either in English, probably in English. So I'll read it in English because you can't see the Hebrew anyway. But Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi would say, this is the second chapter, the first Mishnah. Which is the right path for man to choose for himself? Whichever is harmonious for the one who does it and harmonious for mankind. So this is actually a longer Mishnah, and I'm going to divide it into 3 parts because it's has 3 different sections. So what is the right path for man to choose for himself? Something that is harmonious or beautiful for him, and as also harmonious and beautiful for others, for mankind. Now, let's unpack this a little bit. So the Rambam actually gives a beautiful explanation of this Mishnah. He says, instead of reading it as, what is the right path for man to choose for himself, ? Rather, you can read it as, what is the right path, ? Answer, for man to choose for himself. Now, why would the Rambam read it like this? Because it teaches us a beautiful lesson. He's saying that the proper path in regards to Torah is that a man should choose for himself. Each person should choose to learn the Torah with their own initiative, meaning it's great to learn the Torah and keep the mitzvot in a way of like, this is something I learned from when I was a small child. It's something I have to learn. It's something I have to keep because this is just the religion I was born into, or the family I was born into. And that is called, what we call that in Judaism is Kabbalas Ol, which is keeping the Torah because you say, God commanded me to do this and I'm going to do it, whether I understand it or not, whether I feel it or not. I'm going to do it because this is the right thing to do. And that's an important thing. But the Rambam is teaching us that that's only step 1. Step 2 is that you have to choose it for yourself. It has to come from within you. And if a person keeps the Torah in a way of like a master and a servant, like I'm doing this because God is my master and I have no choice and I have to do it no matter what. That's important because it keeps you committed. But the Rambam teaches us here, it's not the proper path because it doesn't bring the emotion. It doesn't bring the feeling and the passion for it. You're doing it because you have to, because you have no choice. But you didn't choose it for yourself. You didn't feel personally connected to it. And so it's lacking something. It's not the proper way. And so the Rambam just changes up by changing the grammar of the sentence and moving a question mark to the middle of the sentence. All of a sudden, it brings this deep understanding of the proper path that God wants from each of us is to choose it for ourselves. It should be something that we're excited about, that we're passionate about, that we chose because we love it and we want to connect with God, not because we feel coerced or forced. So that's just the Rambam's interpretation, which is beautiful. But really what this beginning of the Mishnah is teaching us is the idea of balance. And we've spoken about this in previous classes, so I don't want to go too much in depth because we did actually spend a whole class discussing this idea. If you remember the first Pirkei Avot class we did, which was I think 2 weeks ago, we discussed the idea of a balance, right? We said that the Torah, the world stands on 3 legs. We said Torah, Avoda, which is prayer, and Maisim Tovim, acts of kindness. And we said that what does it mean that it stands? It needs all 3 to stand. Like a tripod has 3 legs, and if it's missing 1 leg, it's going to fall over. And we discussed this idea of balance, that we need all 3 to balance out our Judaism and who we are as people. And so what this Mishnah is referencing that same idea of balance, that the proper path is when someone chooses it for themselves and when it's harmonious for them and for others, which means that, let's say we discussed this in that class, if somebody dedicates their whole Judaism to acts of kindness, right? Acts of giving. And they say, this is my way of serving God by just giving to others. I love chesed. I love kindness. And I just want to volunteer and do goodness and help others. And that's beautiful. But like we said, it's unbalanced because it's only harmonious for others. It also has to be something harmonious for you, which is your personal connection with God that comes through prayer and that comes through learning. And the same thing goes for the other extreme. If somebody says, I am an intellectual, I love to learn, I love to hear new ideas, my Judaism is learning Torah. And what the Mishnah is saying, that's also unbalanced because you're not dedicating yourself to others. You're not giving of yourself to others. And so that's harmonious for you, but it's not harmonious for others, for mankind. And so this Mishnah is bringing out that same idea of balance, that we need both. We need to fill up our own cup and, work on our connection with God and our spirituality, but we also have to give to others. And that creates the perfect balance when it's harmonious for oneself and it's also harmonious for others. So that's part 1 of the Mishnah. I'm going to move on to the second part because this is where I want to focus the majority of our class because there's a lot to unpack here. And it might be a little hard with you're not being able to see the text, but we'll do our best. Okay, so I'll read it slowly, and hopefully it's okay that you can't see it on your screen. I apologize. So the Mishnah continues, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, "Be as careful with a minor mitzvah as with a major mitzvah, for you do not know the reward for a mitzvah. Consider the loss incurred when performing a mitzvah against its reward, and the gain obtained by committing a sin against the loss it incurs." So what he's saying here is that we do not know the value of a mitzvah. Just because one mitzvah seems big and another one seems small, if we can even call any mitzvah small, we cannot make that judgment of this mitzvah is important and this one is not important, because that's not a judgment that we can make because we have no idea the spiritual impact of each mitzvah. And it could be that what seems small in our eyes is actually really, really great in the eyes of God. And so we cannot judge which mitzvah is great and which mitzvah is small. And then he goes on to say that you should consider the loss incurred when performing a mitzvah against its reward. And on the other side, consider the gain that you get from committing a sin, God forbid, against the loss that it affects. So let's understand this slowly. First of all, the Rambam, again, he has a whole commentary on Pirkei Avot. And what does he say about this Mishnah, this phrase? He says something really beautiful, that often we think that something that happens more often is less important. And something that happens once a year, once in a lifetime, those things are more important. And he says this is not the case. And he gives a beautiful example. He says, the most important thing for a person's survival is air, right? To be able to breathe. We need oxygen to breathe. Now, oxygen is very, very accessible. It's everywhere. It's not rare at all. Yet it is the most crucial thing for a person to be able to survive. And he says the second tier of what a person needs to live is water. Water is also very readily available. Maybe not as much as air, but it is still very much accessible. He says food is the next most important thing for a person to survive. Food takes a little bit more effort, a little harder to prepare or get yourself food. And he says, not food, bread. He says bread is like the third thing that a person needs to sustain themselves. And he says meat is the fourth thing that a person would need to sustain themselves. Meat is the least important, and it's also the least accessible, right? It's the most expensive out of air, water, bread, and meat. Meat is the most expensive. It's the least accessible, and yet it's the least important, right? For a person to survive, meat is less important than bread, and bread is less important than water, and water is less important than air. And so he says, this is a perfect example of how just because something is more common or more available doesn't mean that it's less important. Actually, the things that we need at every moment are more important to a certain extent than the things that we only need once a week or once a year. And so he says, many people practice Judaism in a way where they think that the holidays or the mitzvot that come around once a year, like Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, are less important than the mitzvot that come around every day, like Moda Ani, or like saying our morning prayers, or Shabbat, which comes around every single week. And he says it's actually the opposite, the Rambam teaches us. The mitzvot that come around every single day, and sometimes even 3 times a day, right? Prayer is something that we have 3 times a day, or every single week, like Shabbat, are more crucial for our connection with God than the mitzvot that come around once a year, like fasting on Yom Kippur or hearing the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. And we have this misconception that just because it's less common, it's more important because it only comes around once a year. But the Rambam teaches us that it's actually the opposite. The reason we have certain mitzvot every single day is because it's crucial for our survival as Jews. We need to acknowledge and feel grateful to God every single day. Shabbat comes around every week because taking that time to disconnect from our physical reality and connect with our family, connect with God is so important. It can't come only once a year. We need it every single week because it's so, so, so important. And so this gives us this little mind shift of don't assume that because something comes around once a year, it's more important than something that we have the opportunity to do every single day. This also, I think, connects to something we discussed last week. Everything connects in the Torah, as we see, but we discussed last week the idea of, we think that helping somebody across the world is more noble than being kind to our spouse or being kind to the person that we see every day at work. And actually, it's the opposite. It's more crucial to be kind and sensitive to the people that we interact with every single day than the person that lives on the other side of the world. There's a beautiful story that brings out this point where there was a Jew that was locked in a communist prison, and he was imprisoned for spreading or teaching Judaism. And he was granted 1 day of freedom, to reunite with his family for one day, to spend one day with his family. And this Jew, he didn't know which day to choose. What an opportunity. So he actually sent a letter to the Rebbe, and he said, which day should I choose to be free? Should I choose Yom Kippur? Should I choose Passover to be able to have a Seder with my children? Should I choose Rosh Hashanah, the day where I can go to shul and hear the shofar with my kids and my wife? And the Rebbe answered, you should choose the soonest possible day. If that's tomorrow, choose tomorrow. Even if it's a Tuesday, a random day, the soonest opportunity you have to go home, that's the day that you should choose. And the message, of course, was that instead of waiting for these grandiose opportunities, focus on the opportunity you have right in front of you. The person that you have right in front of you is the most important person in the world. The moment that you have right now is the most important moment, because that's the only moment that exists, really. Like, this moment right now is all that exists. And often we spend a lot of time thinking about future moments, thinking about opportunities that will one day arise, instead of focusing on the opportunity that stands right in front of us. And it's the same idea of when you're sitting with a friend and you're on your phone texting a different friend. What you're doing is you're losing the opportunity that sits right in front of you, the connection that you have right in front of you, and prioritizing somebody that's not even with you. And so this is a beautiful lesson that we don't know the value. We can't determine the value of one thing over the next. And we shouldn't assume that just because something is repetitive or daily, that it's less important than something that comes around once a year. So another thing that this Mishnah brings up is this question of, how does God value our mitzvot? We know that we've discussed this in the past, that mitzvot are physical actions, right? God specifically merged physicality and spirituality. And Judaism focuses on this idea of how, in order to achieve a spiritual goal, we need to root ourselves in this physical world, right? Almost all of the mitzvot involve physical actions, right? On Shabbat, we sit and we eat challah. Challah is bread, something very physical and mundane, but we use it for a spiritual purpose. And so, because the mitzvot are physical actions, and that therefore they're very defined, right? We know halakha, Jewish law, gives very specific guidelines for how to fulfill the mitzvot. And so this Mishnah brings up the question, and it's actually a debate in the Talmud. Does God judge us, or I don't like the word judge, does God view our actions based on the final outcome, or on the effort and intention that goes behind it? So are our mitzvot weighed on a scale of how they were performed, or on the effort and the intention that we had behind it? And it's a back and forth debate, and we'll touch on it now. What is this back and forth? So in our world, like in the physical reality, I would say that the outcome is more important than the intention in almost every area. For example, in sports, or for example, in the Olympics, you can have two players that are competing against each other. And player A can have this natural athletic ability, and he may have spent the last 10 years of his life practicing for 6 hours every day to be able to get to the Olympics and play in the Olympics. And player B, for example, he has less of a natural talent. And so he spent the last 10 years practicing for 12 hours every day, morning to night. He practiced his sport all day. And so even though player B put in more hours than player A, it doesn't really matter when it comes to the final day, to the day of the Olympics, when they both are on display. Whoever performs better is going to be the one who wins, right? If player A, who only practiced 6 hours a day, wins the gold medal, player B can't go to the judges and say, hey, it's not fair. I put in double the amount of work than he did. I should win. Of course, he would never say that because we all know that's not how life works. It's not about the effort that they put in. It's about who actually had a better time, who crossed the finish line first. That's who wins. It's not about who put in more effort. And so even though a person may have put in more effort, it doesn't mean that their outcome is going to be better. Unfortunately, that's just the reality that we have in our world. You could say the same thing for business, right? There are some people that spend their whole life trying to build up a business, and maybe their business stays as a small business their whole life and they never really make it. And another person can have this lucky break and, with very minimal effort, they become wealthy. And so it's not, we see in our physical reality that it's not actually about the effort that determines who wins or who is better. It's more about the final product. And so the question is, does Judaism abide by the same rule? For example, if you have a Jew living in the ghetto, right? Back in Europe, many years ago, and they want to celebrate Passover, they want to get matzah, but it was impossible to get matzah in the ghetto. And so they saved up flour their whole year. And on the day before Passover, they baked matzah and they risked their life and they saved up the whole year just to bake this matzah. And let's say, for example, this is just an example. Let's say that the matzah rose and it turned into chametz, it turned into bread. Which sometimes happens when you bake, it doesn't always go as planned. And unfortunately, their matzah wasn't able to be used as matzah on Passover, even though they put in all this effort, even though they put in all of this thought and intention. And then you can have a Jew living in 2022 that Passover comes along, they go to the supermarket, the kosher store, and for $10, they buy a pack of matzah without any thought. And they were able to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah on Passover. So how does God look at this, right? One person put in all of this effort and desire to fulfill the mitzvah, and the other person just went to the supermarket, swiped their credit card, and were able to purchase matzah. So one of them actually fulfilled the mitzvah of eating matzah, but the other one had all of this effort and all of this intention. So how does God view this? How does the Torah view these two scenarios? So there's no one answer. It's actually both, because it's not one or the other. Because really, when it comes to mitzvot, like we've discussed in the past, the action matters. The outcome does matter, because, each mitzvah is a physical act that has a spiritual effect. It's like a spiritual chemical reaction. Imagine each mitzvah is like the specific instructions to achieving a certain spiritual reality. And so if those actions were not taken, unfortunately, that spiritual reality was not created. For example, if somebody, God forbid, was ill and they went to the pharmacy and by accident, the pharmacist gave them the wrong medication. They could have had all of the right intentions, but if they didn't take the right medication, just physically, their illness is not healed because they didn't take the proper medication. So too, in our mission of making this world a better place, we have to do the mitzvot. And if the mitzvot are not done, we're not affecting that change in the world. So the action, the final action does matter, we see. It does make a difference if the final action was done. But then we can say, how is this fair, right? One person put in all of this intention, all of this effort, and the other person did it just without that much thought, with much ease. And one person is considered to have done the mitzvah and the other isn't. How could this be fair? And so here we have the answer in this Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi answers this question for us when he says, consider the loss incurred when performing a mitzvah against its reward. Meaning, yes, whether you did the mitzvah or not is determined by if the action was done. Very practically, was the action done or not? Was the matzah eaten or not? Was the Torah read or not? It's a very simple question, right? either the mitzvah was done or it wasn't. However, he says, the loss that a person went through to perform a mitzvah, meaning the effort that they put in, the money that they may have lost, the time that they may have lost, whatever they invested of themselves to be able to perform the mitzvah, that is the reward that they're going to get. That is how God sees them. So even though the final outcome may have not been done, their intention, the loss that they had to go through to be able to perform this mitzvah, that is how God sees them. That is their reward, which is a beautiful concept, that even if the final action wasn't exactly how it was meant to be, God sees our effort. He sees our intention, and he sees the what we sacrificed to do something. Imagine you have two people on a plane, and they're both going to the same destination. They're both traveling from PBI to New York, right? One person booked way in advance and they got the ticket for $200. The second guy put in $600 because he booked it last minute. They're both going to the same destination, but one guy paid $200 and the other paid $600. The same thing applies to mitzvot, right? Sometimes two people can both be doing the same mitzvah, but the effort that they have to put in to fulfill that mitzvah is vastly different. One person, let's say, was raised in a religious home and it comes to them easily. It's natural. They don't have to think about it. They don't have to learn about it. They do it by rote. They do it naturally. It's something that they've been doing since they were a small child. It's easy for them. And the other person has to learn about it, has to engage with it, think about it, and maybe put in a lot of work and effort to be able to fulfill the mitzvah. The example that comes to mind is keeping Shabbat, right? For some people, they live close to the synagogue. They kept Shabbat their whole life. And so it's easy for them to keep Shabbat. Every Shabbat rolls around and they keep it once again. But someone else, perhaps, they don't live close to the synagogue. It's hard for them. Their family doesn't keep Shabbat. So they're the only one, they're the odd one out that's not on their phone or not going online or not working. And they have to put in all of this sacrifice and all of this effort just to keep one Shabbat. And you could say, God, how is this fair? One person has it so easy and the other person has it so challenging. And yet the outcome is the same. Both of them are keeping the same mitzvah at the end of the day. So how could it be that one has it with such ease and the other has it with so much sacrifice and so much effort? And the answer is here that God values the effort, and the reward of the mitzvah is going to be commensurate with the effort, the loss that a person had to go through to fulfill that mitzvah. And so what this teaches us really is to never feel down, to never judge another person and say, like, they have it so easy. Why is it so easy for them and so hard for me? For some people, being kind is a real challenge. They have to think about each word that they say. And for another person, it comes naturally. And so you could say, God, why did you give me this challenge? It shouldn't be so hard for me. And the answer here is that you should rejoice in that challenge, because the more challenging it is for you, the more reward and the more celebration it is when you actually fulfill the mitzvah. And we see from Rabbi Yehuda Hanessi's words that the same exact thing applies for Aveirot, for sins, right? What does he say? Also, you should consider the gain obtained by committing a sin against the loss that it incurs. What does this mean? The same thing as the mitzvah, but the opposite, right? If somebody does something wrong, someone does a sin, but they do it with guilt, they do it with pain, they do it by accident. It's not this, even though the same action may have been done, the end result was the same. It's not the same, because God knows the intention. If somebody does something with no guilt, with no remorse, they do it and they enjoy it. They do the sin and they actually enjoy it. They get benefit from it. That is obviously way worse than somebody who does it and they feel guilty after, they feel remorse and they feel sorry. And they didn't enjoy it because they were feeling so remorseful, And the same thing, of course, in the Torah, there's a difference between, there's something called something that was done b'mezid or b'shogeg, right? B'mezid is by accident, b'shogeg is on purpose. And this applies in like regular legal law as well, right? If somebody is in a trial for murder, God forbid, there's a difference between somebody who murdered by accident and somebody who murdered on purpose. There's a very big difference, and the outcome, even though the outcome is the same, right? The intention matters. The intention makes a difference. And so too with our actions, right? If somebody did something by accident, right? If you insulted somebody by accident and you felt terrible about it afterwards, it's not the same as if you insulted somebody and you meant it, or you insulted somebody and afterwards you felt good about it. Your ego was boosted. There's a very big difference between those two scenarios, even though the outcome was the same insult was given, but you personally, the way you felt makes a difference, and God sees that. And that is the third part of this Mishnah, right? I'm sorry again that you can't see it, but what I have in front of me is the third part of the Mishnah. And he continues and says, contemplate 3 things and you will not come to the hands of sin. Number 1, know what is above you, an eye that sees, an ear that hears, and all of your deeds are recorded in a book. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi to conclude the Mishnah. And really, it's a continuation of what he was teaching us before, that just because the end result looks the same doesn't mean that it is the same. 2 people could keep Shabbat, but the effort that was put into it is vastly different. 2 people could give the same insult, but the feeling behind it was so different. So the action is different, and God hears us, he sees us, and our actions are recorded. God knows the intention behind what we do. He knows the feeling. A good example of this in Judaism is, of course, prayer, right? We know that when it comes to prayer, intention, interestingly enough, is all that matters, because there's no mitzvah, there's no specific commandment to rattle off Hebrew words. That's not a mitzvah. Prayer in Judaism is called avodat halev, the service of the heart. And the mitzvah in prayer is the intention. That's all that matters, really. I mean, the prayers itself were like the Hebrew prayers that we say, the structure of the prayers were actually instituted many years later by the Anshe Knesset Hagadola. And if anyone was on last week's class, we discussed this group of men last week. They're the ones they were a group of 70 rabbis that would determine the Jewish law back in the times of the temple. And they were the ones who actually came up with the words of prayer, because it used to be before their time. It used to be that a person, the Jewish people were on a spiritual level, that they were able to really pray from their heart, meaning they were able to, they spoke Hebrew, and they were able to come up with these prayers on their own, because they had that spiritual stature where they were so connected with God that when they felt appreciation, when they felt gratitude, and when they needed something, they were able to really pray from their heart. Now, the Anshe Knesset Hagadola realized that the Jews were losing this ability. Our spiritual decline made it that the Jewish people were no longer able to really pray from their heart. And so they realized we have to write down specific prayers so that when a person is praying for someone that's ill, there's a prayer that they can say. When someone is praying a prayer of gratitude, there's a prayer that they can say for that. And we need to make it more specific. But that's not how it was originally intended to be. Prayer was originally intended to be the service of the heart. That's literally what it's called in the Torah, because that's what it is. It's something that has to come from the heart. So when in regards to prayer, in this regard, prayer is unique from all other mitzvot, because you can have 2 people. One person reads perfect Hebrew and is saying all the words perfectly with their perfect pronunciations, but they have no feeling, they're thinking about their shopping list, or they're thinking about their to-do list while they're saying the words. And another person can barely read Hebrew, but they follow along and they feel the connection with God when they pray, and they have all of the right intentions, and they feel gratitude, and they really connect to God during prayer. And at the end of the day, the outcome is different, because one person rattled off Hebrew words and the other person truly accomplished what prayer is meant to accomplish, which is a connection with God, gratitude, and asking God for the things that we need. And so prayer is unique because with prayer, the intention actually matters more than the action. there's a beautiful story about the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov was the founder of the Hasidic movement. He lived in a place called Mezabush, Ukraine. It's actually a place that I have visited, and it's very cool because in Mezabush, the place where he's buried, they have his synagogue. His synagogue still exists to this day. I mean, with the war, it makes me sad to think about like what has happened to that area now. But when I was there, I spent a Shabbat there, and you can actually go to his synagogue. And like, for me, all the stories that I had heard about this great rabbi came to life when I was there, because I was spending Shabbat in his synagogue. And so there's a story that happened in his synagogue that there was a pogrom that was going to come. And the Jewish people, all of the great men of the town, they came to the synagogue to pray and to beg God to help them and to save them from this horrible decree. And the men were deep in prayer and crying out to God to save them. And it says that a little farmer boy, arrived at the synagogue, and he grew up on a farm somewhere in Ukraine, and he didn't speak Hebrew. He didn't even know the Aleph Bet. And he walked into the synagogue, and he felt the intensity. He felt the connection with God that these men were achieving. And he so wanted to pray to God, but he didn't have the words to do so. And being a little farm boy, the only expressions that he knew were he knew how to mimic the sounds of the animals that he would take care of on his farm. And so he started to, in his like love and connection with God in that moment, this little Jewish boy started to make the sound that a rooster makes. This is the story. It says that he started to say like kukariku in the synagogue. In the back of the synagogue, he was crying out to God, making this rooster sound. And the story goes that the men in the synagogue tried to shush him. They tried to say, "What are you doing, little boy? Stop making these sounds. This is ridiculous. We're in the middle of praying. How could you make these nonsense sounds?" And the Baal Shem Tov stopped them, and he said, "This little boy, his prayers are having more effect up in heaven than all of our prayers combined. His prayer is so genuine. It's so heartfelt that the fact that he doesn't know the Hebrew words doesn't matter at all. He's praying from his heart, which is, as we discussed, that's what prayer is. It's supposed to come from the heart." And the Baal Shem Tov really brought out this lesson that the connection with God that comes from the heart is more powerful than the Hebrew words that are recited. But that's in a way, prayer is unique, because with all mitzvot, the lesson that we learn here, and I'll wrap up now, and we'll open up for some questions, is that the actions matter. The actions definitely matter. We know that mitzvot matter. Doing the action in its proper way, in the way that God intended, makes a difference, because that's the spiritual effect that it can have. But God sees us, he hears us, and he knows the intention behind everything we do. And so Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi teaches us here to consider the loss of a mitzvah. What did you lose to perform this mitzvah? What did you invest to perform this mitzvah? According to that investment that you made, that intention that you had, that is how much reward God gives you. That is how much credit you have, because you performed the mitzvah with the proper intention. And even if the outcome wasn't perfect, the intention and the desire to connect with God was there. And so this beautiful lesson of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is really that, to me, it comes down to judgment, right? Often we can look at somebody's actions from the outside, and we don't know the intention that goes behind it. Only God knows the thought and the sacrifice that somebody made to do something, you know? And so just because someone is doing something doesn't mean that we can judge them if they're wrong or right, because we have no idea what their intention is. We have no idea what is behind the scenes, right? And so, you know, religious or not religious, it doesn't really matter, right? That's why, like, there shouldn't be this like big differentiation between like someone who's religious and someone who's not, because every mitzvah is unique and every mitzvah has its proper intention. And there are religious people who do all the mitzvot, but they don't have any of the right intentions. And so who's to say that one Jew or one mitzvah is better than the next? No one is to say that besides God. So that is the beautiful lesson of Yehuda Hanasi and the Rambam, that we don't know the background behind somebody's actions. And so we can never judge them. And as people, we should never judge one mitzvah over the next. We should never say this mitzvah is more important than another, because we don't know which mitzvah means the most to God. They all mean so much to God, and we can't make that judgment. So that's today's Mishnah. I apologize for all of the technical difficulties this morning. And if anyone has any questions or any thoughts that they would like to share, we can do that now. On my phone, it's a little bit more challenging to see all of you. So
I have a question.
yes, who is that?
Elaine
Helene. Hi, Helene.
Eagle.
Hi.
It just popped up. It's not the most important question that I have, but it's a question. If you want to go to shul and you live far away from the shul, Orthodox shul, is it okay to drive there because your intention is that you want to be with God and spend Shabbos, or is it that you need to make other arrangements?
It's a good question.
Yeah. Just
So
curious.
it's a nuanced question. I mean, it did bring something up for me. Like, I do want to clarify something, that like the mitzvot still have to be done in the way that God intended. Meaning a person can't have the right intentions, but just do something completely different, right? So they go hand in hand, right? The final result and the intention have to be, hand in hand. When it comes to Shabbat, it's very complicated, especially because there are many different, every Jew is on their own level, and everyone practices Judaism in the way that as much as they can, everyone's limit is different. And so like, there is a concept of like, keeping Shabbat is not an all or nothing, but like, driving on Shabbat is not something that, any electricity really we try to avoid, because according to Jewish law, we don't use electricity on Shabbat. But that being said, for some Jews, like coming to shul is their connection. So it's hard for me to answer that question, Helene. I think that's more of a question to ask, a rabbi, somebody who deals with Jewish law. I don't want to answer that question personally, just because I don't think it's my place. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just
No,
don't
no,
think
that's okay.
answer
It's
because
complicated,
it's nuanced. Every Jew is different. Every connection, and it's something that's nuanced. And I don't want to, answer personally, but it's definitely a good question, and it's something that could be brought up with your local rabbi. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. The class was great.
Thank you, Helene. Definitely the outcome, like the lesson, the takeaway from this class is that they go hand in hand, right? God doesn't value one thing over the next. So the outcome is important. The final outcome is important. And that's why we have Jewish law, because Jewish law tells us the specific outcome that God is looking for. But at the same time, the lesson of this class is that God values our intention. He values the effort that we put into a mitzvah, and they go hand in hand, the outcome, the final action, and the intention that we put into it. So I hope that's clear. Thank you, ladies, for joining. I hope next week my internet will be a little more cooperative. But I appreciate you all for being patient and for joining this Torah learning class. And I'll see you all next week, or I'll see you on Shabbat. Have a great week, and Shabbat Shalom. Bye, ladies.
Bye. Hey, we're still